Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. I'm really glad you're joining us today because we're diving into a topic that's, well, incredibly sensitive and often deeply painful. But honestly, from a psychological perspective, it is absolutely fascinating. We're going to break down the exact necessary steps for professional counseling after infidelity. Look, when a marriage gets hit by betrayal, the emotional chaos that follows can feel completely unmanageable. But as you'll see today, healing isn't just a matter of waiting it out or sheer willpower. It's actually a highly structured clinical process. So let's jump right in. Here's our roadmap for today. We're covering the myth of moving on, diagnosing the affair, assessing emotion, bridging the gap, managing PTSD, and finally, we'll look at the timeline for healing. All right, section 1, the myth of moving on, old advice versus clinical reality. Forgive each other and move on. You've probably heard this, right? It's basically exactly what traumatized couples have been told for generations. Especially in the past, institutions like churches would hand this out as standard advice to couples dealing with infidelity. And look, it sounds nice. It's totally well-meaning. But clinically, yeah, experts found out the hard way that this simply doesn't work. You just can't sweep systemic betrayal under the rug and expect the foundation of a marriage to hold. Because here is the absolutely crucial takeaway. True recovery, it's not just waking up one day and deciding to forgive. It requires a science. It's a structured process. A professional infidelity recovery specialist doesn't just walk into a broken marriage with empathy. They bring a very specific, tested methodology to literally rehabilitate the relationship. It's like taking the damage apart, examining it, and rebuilding it piece by piece. And that builds the foundation of the clinical journey we're about to break down. Here are the specific chronological steps a professional uses. 1. Diagnosing the type of affair. 2. Assessing the current emotional state. 3. Reconciling radically different perspectives. And 4. Treating the resulting trauma. Moving to Section 2, Step 1. Diagnosing the affair. So the very first thing a recovery specialist has to do is figure out exactly what kind of infidelity occurred. Because no, not all affairs are the same. One of the toughest ones they see is called the exit affair. This is a scenario where a spouse shows absolutely zero remorse for their cheating. Clinically speaking, this often means they actually want the marriage to end, and they're using the affair as a really destructive mechanism to just force their way out of the relationship. The reality of this diagnosis is pretty stark. If a specialist spots an exit affair or just a massive lack of remorse, solo efforts by the offended spouse are going to fail completely. For anything to actually change, for any healing to even begin, both partners absolutely must be in joint professional counseling. You just can't unilaterally save a marriage if the other person is actively searching for the exit door. On to Section 3, assessing the emotional response. Once they know what kind of affair it is, the specialist looks at how the offended partner is reacting. And honestly, this might sound completely backward at first glance. A specialist actually views deep hurt and intense anger as a healthy response to infidelity. Why? Because it means you still care. The connection is severely damaged, sure, but it's still alive. The worrying response, though, that's when a spouse is just completely cold and numb. Not angry, not upset, just existing. To a clinician, this numbness is a massive red flag. It literally means that person has psychologically signed out of the marriage. Pulling someone back from that numbness takes some really intense counseling. Section 4, bridging the perspective gap. Now we're heading what might be the absolute most complex challenge for the counselor, the massive psychological gap between the two spouses regarding what the affair actually meant. A huge hurdle in therapy is that men and women often do not view sex and intimacy through the same lens. In a lot of observed cases, an offending male partner might see sex as entirely physical, totally stripped of emotional weight, which, as you can imagine, creates a total roadblock in the counseling room. It's a crazy disconnect. You'll constantly hear the offender claim, "It meant nothing, it was just physical." Think about a guy who genuinely loves his wife, treats her like an absolute queen, but cheats on her with someone seemingly incompatible or inferior. He's sitting there baffled as to why it's such a big deal, because to him, it meant nothing. But look at the offended partner's reality. You broke trust in me, the marriage, and everything we had. It's not just a physical mistake, it's a total systemic betrayal of their entire life. And right there is where the professional steps in and drops this incredibly powerful clinical intervention. It means nothing to whom? The therapist literally forces the offender to realize that their own personal definition of meaning does not magically invalidate their partner's shattered reality. Sure, it may have meant nothing to you, but to them, it broke everything. Bridging that gap in empathy is a mandatory step in the science of recovery.
All right, Section 5, Managing Triggers and PTSD.
So, as the couple works through these wild perspective differences, they enter the long-term management phase of counseling, dealing with the daily psychological fallout. Think about this highly relatable scenario. Say you caught your spouse cheating on their phone. Why is it that, months later, seeing them wake up in the middle of the night and smile at a screen suddenly sends you into a total spiral of panic? The answer to that is infidelity-induced PTSD. And the specialist actively validates this. They confirm that this intense panic isn't an overreaction. You're not quote-unquote being crazy. It is a clinically recognized trauma condition. Every time that specific trigger happens, like the glowing phone in the dark, your body just launches into a severe anxiety response. So a massive part of the recovery process is actively treating this PTSD, giving the offended spouse the tools to manage the triggers, and teaching the offending spouse how to navigate them safely without doing more harm. And finally, Section 6, the timeline for healing. So you're probably wondering, how long does all of this actually take? If you're going through this, you've got to set realistic expectations, and the stark reality, straight from infidelity recovery specialists, is 6 to 24. That is the number of months it takes to fully recover. Healing is definitely not an overnight fix, guys. It is a sustained, long-term clinical effort. To break that timeline down a bit, that initial first month is literally just crisis management, stopping the bleeding. But clinically speaking, it takes a minimum of 6 months, and very often up to 24 months to truly, fully recover from the infidelity. And normalizing this long, tough road ahead is so important, right? That way, couples don't just throw in the towel when they aren't completely fixed after just a few weeks of therapy. Which brings us to the core takeaway of this entire explainer. Navigating exit affairs, bridging massive perspective gaps, treating literal PTSD, and managing a 2-year emotional timeline, yeah, that's not exactly something you can just hash out at the kitchen table. It requires specialized help. You really need a professional infidelity recovery specialist to guide the ship. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought as we wrap up today's explainer. True recovery isn't just about wanting things to be better. It's about getting in there and doing the work. Knowing what we now know about the strict structure, the heavy psychology, and that long timeline required, are you prepared to commit to the science of healing? Thanks so much for hanging out with me today, and keep learning.